Thanks, Adrian. I wonder if we can put up do we have a list of the questions that are in the agenda for the session? I think that'd be helpful to put up and maybe kick off the discussion by looking at those and asking Jesse or maybe Adrian to extend your presentation sort of with these questions in mind. So as you looked at these trials and then the Sentinel example, which obviously the Sentinel system has mostly claims data available to evaluate, as well as some electronic health record data. In terms of if you were going to set up that study for the first time in Sentinel, and you were asking, well, are the data available in this system appropriate for asking these questions? And I think a lot of the questions were around safety, but in terms of the first three questions that we have in the agenda, is accuracy good enough to predict or to identify the right population? Is accuracy good enough to identify the exposure, the intervention, and then also the outcomes of interest? And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the safety versus maybe some of the effectiveness outcomes, and just tackling those three questions. Are those the right ones to sort of lend itself to really knowing if that data source is appropriate?
Yeah, so if you just think about the right population and right exposure and the right outcome, certainly you can get closer, you can define a population that would be similar to the clinical trials, but likely would be broader compared to the inclusion criteria of the clinical trials, as well as just the selection process of a patient who has to go through an informed consent process. Regarding the exposure, there, at least with Sentinel, there's quite a bit good accuracy regarding the exposure. It's not as heavily monitored in terms of, say, the clinical trials, which evaluate, in this case, time and therapeutic range at the end of the trial. So you have less information about that. And then the outcomes is quite interesting, especially as some of them evolve over time. And so just thinking about the case of acute myocardial infarction, as things have evolved in that area, where we have assays that have a greater sensitivity for troponins, and also have assays clinically that are done more routinely for every person who comes into the emergency department, then you have probably a mix of different types of MIs or cardiovascular conditions that may have positive troponins and get flagged as an MI in, say, an electronic health record system or claims. So there's definitely more variability around that, but the question is, does that lead to a systemic bias or other confounding? So
Jesse and Greg, any thoughts on that? And also, sort of extending beyond Sentinel, but EHR data, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. A few comments. One is on population. And I agree with Adrian's comments, but we've done a bunch of work in diabetes. And the length of time we spent debating how are we going to define diabetes for this analysis, for this question, how do we define diabetes? Is it a code? Is it a code plus drug? And there's 1,000 variations. Nigam Shah at Stanford has this idea, in diabetes specifically, of saying, suppose we could develop a predictive model of who really, whatever gold standard we use, can we come up with a predictive model that classifies somebody as having a probability of being a diabetic? So he's got this idea of somebody being a 0.8 diabetic. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the way we should go, but it's an interesting concept. So that's one point. And we're often not going to have lab values. EHRs, the electronic health records, are better about lab values. So anytime you're trying to replicate entry criteria for a clinical trial that needed lab values to get somebody in, that's a little more challenging in real-world data. Just a brief reminder about exposure, that what we're getting typically out of EHRs is a prescription for a drug. and what we're getting out of claims is a dispensing. So somebody paid for it. But we still don't know whether the person's actually taking it or taking it correctly. I've got a great slide somewhere of a woman using an inhaler, an asthma inhaler, and she probably goes and refills her prescription regularly. She's using it upside down. So then in terms of outcomes, I don't want to drift off into a lengthy discussion about validation. There's evidence on both sides. There's some publications from 10 or 12 years ago showing that for some of the large cardiovascular trials, whether you use the site-reported events or the centrally adjudicated events, you get the same answer. There was a publication in 2014, I have it in my notes, from the Women's Health Study, Women's Health Initiative, where they went, and so I think this is not drawing the bullseye, I don't think. It's not. So what they did was they took people over 65 from the Women's Health Initiative, went to Medicare to get the events out of Medicare. Instead of using the adjudicated events from the trial, they went to Medicare and asked, if we had done this trial using Medicare claims data, instead of adjudicated, CRFs and whatever, would we have gotten the same answer? And the relative risks were 1.29 versus 1.31. So going straight to the claims data. And an important point is when they went to individuals, there are some cases that were picked up by one and not the other, and the reverse. So the claims were actually identifying cases that the trial missed, and vice versa. So I think you might be asking the wrong question if you go to that level of granularity to see whether the outcomes match up on an individual basis. That may be the wrong question. The right question is, overall, do we get the right answer? And I think there are ways to validate that in advance without drawing the bullseye after the fact.
One thing to add to that, Greg, is that for each of these areas, population, exposure, and outcome, you can do sensitivity and specificity about those definitions. Those are things that can be pre-specified, and also what can help in terms of what's the robustness there. And so, for example, using the diabetes example, or say whether it's atrial fibrillation, if there's something that you're dependent on a lab for defining it, it'll come to, it depends on whether that's routinely checked. And so if the answer is it's dependently checked, then yes, that can be incorporated. But there's some things you don't know until you look, and so, but you can define that as things go forward. And at least from the Annals article, one thing I liked about that was that they did have an approach in terms of understanding that there is variability in terms of what the precision for these definitions could be, and so including that so you can evaluate what's the robustness. For a clinical trial, we have one definition that we go with, and that's for the duration. So,
Greg, any additions?
One of the, I'm looking at the notes that Andy sent, and one point he made that I think had a nice sort of scheme of thinking about a sort of, in some ways a cascade or chain, beginning with, what is the clinical phenomenon of interest? Whether we're talking about eligibility or prognostic characteristics or the outcome, I think ultimately we're concerned about something that is happening inside of a person's body or that they are experiencing, something about their health state or something about their symptom state or functioning. And we have to start with a question, if we're going to rely on data generated from community practice or from real-world settings, do we believe that real-world providers can accurately assess that thing that we want to measure? So that's sort of foundational. If the answer to that is no, if we say assessing that thing we need to assess requires some special training, some special technology, some special tool that isn't out there, then I think we say that then we've got to do it the old-fashioned way. That I think that ultimately there should be an empirical answer to that question. Can real-world providers assess this thing accurately? But I think we need to begin with clear thinking. We need to begin with conceptual clarity about exactly what is that state and then say, would the real world be able to accurately recognize that state?
And whether the incentives are to do so. So reimbursement, for instance. So.
Oh, actually, that was Andy's sort of his next point, which was, in that chain of events from a provider would have the capacity, a provider would have the ability to recognize that state, then what would be the sort of, the technical and business and cultural environment that might influence the recording of that state? And that is quite important. I can tell you that when major depressive disorder became a Medicare risk-adjusted diagnosis and depression not otherwise specified was not, the ratio of those two diagnoses in most large health systems flipped overnight, essentially. The epidemiology of depressive disorders in the United States, I do not believe, changed very much, but the incentives that govern the recording changed spectacularly, and therefore the signal. So we would certainly need to know whether there are incentives about recording things or recording them in a certain way.
Let me just jump in on that. And I think I changed my mind in the last 30 seconds about how strongly I believe this. But so if you go to the Sentinel website, there are tables of outcomes. And for each, it's essentially a detailed literature review that gets into what are the algorithms based on claims data for making this diagnosis. And they don't go the next step and say, this one's okay, this one's not okay. They're just kind of laying out the data. But one thing that the conversation this morning made me think about is an algorithm that was validated 10 years ago may need revalidation next week because things are changing.
No, well, I was just going to say so partly because of the concept may have changed in terms of recognition of the disease or recognition of the intervention and so forth, or the technology has changed, and so that's why the validation, start with that in terms of what's been defined in the past, but also within the context of a major study that may be important.
Okay, great comments. And so I asked you all to, and you did a really good job of commenting on the first three questions on the list and looking at the sort of consistency of identifying the right population, the right exposure, and the right outcome. And clearly, it depends, and you can certainly set up, studies to show the sensitivity and specificity by varying the algorithm to at least know what you're using and the confidence that you can have in what you're using. And the additional question, Greg, that Andy brought up around, do we believe that even the real-world providers can accurately assess the thing? So that's kind of related to sort of the accuracy of the if the real-world provider can assess the right population, or at least note something in the record that is that this is the right population exposure and right outcome. But it sort of frames, when you ask the question, not just can you accurately identify it in the EHR, can you accurately identify it in the claim or whatever the data source is, by phrasing it in a way, can the real-world provider actually accurately identify it, is sort of thinking about it in a different way. And I wonder if that actually becomes another question that we put on the list, because that is an important thing to think through. But then that brings us to the recording side of things. And, if the real-world provider can accurately know, is it actually being accurately recorded into the data source that you have? And that actually is a question on our list. Are there concerns about data collection or entry, particularly in relation to creating systematic bias? I've skipped over the safety question. The other one is, are there any big safety issues that would be missed? I think that almost to me seems like a no-brainer that you would want to really look at that, but maybe not. So let me dive into that question a little bit before I move on to the recording, because I think we're going to have a lot of discussion on this panel, and then after all of this, I'm going to open it up to the audience. But this whole question of, was it recorded accurately? Did the recording or the benefit structure that gave rise to the data, did it create any systematic bias? I think that's going to be a big discussion. So before we get to that, maybe we'll turn to the safety that I thought was a no-brainer. But it seems reasonable that if you're thinking about using a real-world data source, and there are, depending on the intervention that you're looking at, if there are big safety issues that might be missed by that data source, you might think twice before using that. But comments?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you define as big. So so if you'd say a big safety outcome such as mortality that's very complete in a data source, then that would be hard to miss. But there could be big safety outcomes that are important to understand. And so a case example I was using was myocardial infarction. And so that was a focus. And so therefore it was predefined. That was an area of question. But there could be other big unknowns that, depending on the life cycle of a medical product, maybe at the beginning of a medical product's life cycle, there may be more unknowns that are only seen with real-world practice, whereas later in the life cycle of a medical product, it'd be harder to see or imagine those big unknowns coming up. So in the anticoagulant story, obviously bleeding is a major safety outcome. But you can imagine if there was something later that was a rare event, but maybe a big important event, would only be known through exposure. So.
One of the points that Andy sent along, I think, is relevant to this, and it's a little technical, but I think it's important. How he phrased it is the distinction between comorbidities, by that meaning, some adverse health state someone experienced before being exposed to a treatment, and complications, and that's all about the timing. Was it broken before I touched it? And the challenge is that, in a traditional sort of measurement context of in a traditional trial, we decide when things are measured. So, there is a starting time that is controlled, and we measure everything before we start. While in a more naturalistic context, things are measured when they're measured. And something may be recorded, and it may be recorded after someone was exposed to a treatment, but we have less certainty about whether it was present before. Because the assessment of things happens when people make visits or when they sought health care for things, and it's not controlled by the study. So it's, a safety event might be missed because no one checked for it, but it also might be difficult to distinguish an adverse event from a pre-existing condition because there was never any definite time where, as in a traditional trial, we say, we are going to measure everything as of today, and then we know what was there before we started.
Yeah, I've got a very long list of stuff, which I'll try to limit. So there's a variation on what you're saying, Greg, which is this idea of channeling bias. So that's maybe probably later in the life cycle of a product when everybody knows that drug X causes this event. So then what happens is the people who are at high risk for that event get prescribed something else that doesn't have that in the label. So now the other thing starts to look like it's increasing risk when it's just that it's the high-risk people who are getting that drug. And we have a paper recently looking at acetaminophen showing that there's definitely channeling of people with a history of MI don't get NSAIDs, they get acetaminophen. GI bleeding.
You're starting to talk about treatment assignment, and I'm going to ring that bell.
Okay. Well, but yeah, my point is that the assessment is effective. That there is a flip side to it, though, which is suppose you're getting false positives, which is I thought where we were going, and that gets back to your safety question because we're always worried about the bias being away from the null, so we're going to get in trouble for something that's not real. but it can go the other way. If you have false positives, and the false positives don't depend on which treatment you get, then that's random misclassification, which is well known to cause bias toward the null. So the danger for a safety problem is that if you're biasing toward the null, you could miss a signal if there's substantial misclassification, and if it doesn't depend on which treatment you get.
I'll say false positives can occur in a clinical trial because, like, every time we finish a clinical trial, we'll get a stack of this for all the SAE reportings and looking at column A versus column B, and people scratching their heads. So,
yeah, but a point is that if you're looking at effectiveness or efficacy, then and there's misclassification for false positives, and it's too bad for the sponsor. You should have done a better job. But it's a problem if it's a safety issue. Then the misclassification is everybody else's problem. It's not the sponsor's problem anymore.
Yeah, I think there's an important general point that came out actually in some of the phone call discussions we had before this meeting about, as you say, that the random or non-selective misclassification generally creating a bias toward the null, but null, if we're trying to prove the superiority of a new product, that's a conservative bias. If we're assessing the safety of a new product, it's in some ways an anti-conservative bias. And then if it's a non-inferiority design, a bias toward the null actually in some ways creates an anti-conservative bias by saying a new product is equal to an existing product when it might not be, because lack of precision in a non-inferiority design leads to a finding of effectiveness rather than a finding of lack of effectiveness. So thinking about how random error, the truism that random error always biases toward the null is not always true, I think.
I was almost going to ding you on that. So bringing this back to the data, though, I mean, it's a very, it's a very good point of on the safety issue, but it does come back, getting to the misclassification. Is that still brings us back to if we believe in the accuracy and the consistency in which the data source is measuring the outcome of interest, and in this case, a safety outcome, such that it's high enough that we think the misclassification issue is not necessarily significant, then as long as we know that if the safety event were to happen, it would be captured in the data, then those questions might be sufficient to move forward with the particular data source. So bringing us back down to the next question, which is this whole thing about how do we know that the recording and the collection of the data aren't adding to the systematic bias? How would we, how do you even begin to ask that before the study? Like, what would be the approach that one would take to really address that question or break that question down?
I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the steps that many are doing is going through very careful data curation and characterization. And so, for example, if a outcome depended on a procedure as defining it, say patients who have an MI that's treated with a coronary intervention, you have to have at least prevalence of that or some expectation that that's routinely there. There have been some examples where people have gone through data characterization and for some reason that was 0. And so that's not a true thing. So that got corrected, and so that the characterization is important. The other aspect here is understanding how very varied certain data definitions are across systems. So, for instance, we talk about different deployments of electronic medical records and how they're used. A colleague of mine teaches his fellows to never code for diabetes because in that EMR system, it pulls up a laundry list of choices that you have to make which doesn't quite fit. And so they basically ignore it. And so they can click through it without doing it. So there are those kind of nuances, but you would be able to pick up what's a systematic issue if you saw relative to a region or expected definition, something that was markedly lower. And so it's really important, at least in my view, to have a careful characterization and comparison to see what should be expected is there.
I'm going to come back to my earlier comments about the need for validation. And I want to emphasize a piece of that we're not talking about necessarily just validating a code, an ICD code for something, but there's an algorithm. And the algorithm, to Adrian's point, this goes back a long time when you're looking at venous thromboembolic events. You don't just, well, some people do, but back in the Boston drug program days, Herschel Jick came up with the idea if you don't just look for a code for a VTE, you look for a therapy, you look for a diagnostic procedure. So now you're not just talking about looking for a code blindly, you're looking for evidence that the code was actually real and it was really an MI and not just rule out MI. So it's possible, but there's a lot of work to be done because there's a lot of outcomes to look at.
Yeah, one of the points that Andy made, which another one it's sort of complicated, is that getting way into the guts of things in terms of the minutia is sort of experts only territory. And that you really sort of need to know some of the intricacies of the in some ways sometimes the plumbing of the electronic health records systems. I know in some of the work we've done in mental health and some of the work we've done in, say, ascertaining suicide attempts, you might believe that providers enter an ICD-10 code. They don't. What they actually enter is typically a text string that just happens to pop in their mind, and then there's a diagnosis suggestion engine. And I could tell you the mapping of diagnosis of text strings to diagnosis suggestion engines. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill all of you because that's proprietary information, But unfortunately, you really need to know all that proprietary information. And if you really want to get into it, you have to track what you really want to know is not what ICD-10 code was assigned by the EHR system. You want to know what text string was entered by the provider. So that gets really complicated, and there's this challenge, or I don't know how to say, this tension between saying we want publicly available, validated, generally accepted algorithms or computable phenotypes for identifying core clinical phenomena like myocardial infarction, or we certainly want, I think, we can say foundationally we want those to be transparent. Those need to be, you can't have top secret algorithms or they're completely, we shouldn't have any credibility at all for that. But they may change over time. And I can tell you these diagnosis suggestion engine search tools actually migrate over time and you have to keep track of them. So even the meaning of that gets pretty complicated. I'm not at all saying this can't be done. I think it has to be done. But the challenge there is it's a bit of a moving target in terms of saying, do we know this to be true?
So Greg, one question, though, is like in something like that, shouldn't you be able to understand whether that issue is coming up or changing over time through, say, comparison of different systems and characterization of how data is being reported? So if using your depression reporting, if it all of a sudden flipped, then something's happened and then you can dive in. But having that as part of kind of the routine kind of hygiene of a study.
Oh yeah, exactly. I think you're exactly right. I mean, what you need to do, both as an ongoing janitorial activity, you need to constantly monitor, and ideally you want to segment your monitoring. You want to say this health system, this data stream within this health system. We know this comes from the hospital and they're using Cerner, and this comes from the outpatient setting and they're using Epic, and this comes from here and they're using this. So we certainly don't want to mix those data streams when we monitor the rates of particular diagnoses appearing. We want to look at them separately so we can see discontinuities. And you see those discontinuities. Now, Sentinel does a very nice job of this, I must say. I think Sentinel's sort of quality monitoring activity, which happens, is really a model that everyone should hope to follow. But that's what you have to do. And when you're dealing with sort of multi-site studies, you need to be you don't want to wait till the end of a large trial to do that. I'm not talking about peeking at the results of a trial while it's ongoing, but I'm talking about continuously monitoring the quality of data streams so you can discover when something broke. And then you'll tell one of your participating health systems or sites that something seems to be broken, and that will activate what I call the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 4 stages of data quality grief that some of you have heard me talk about before. It goes, yeah.
Great. So that sort of brings us to the validation question. And Jesse, it's like you know these questions ahead of time, bringing us to the question of validation. So the way that the question is framed, and this is the last sort of question that the work group thought would be necessary things to ask ahead of time, is when is expert adjudication necessary to confirm? And I wonder if it should be rephrased to be, has the data field or the outcome of interest or the exposure, has that been validated sufficiently versus when? Because I think the answer to when is, well, it depends on how confident you are and whether or not that's an accurate and reliable way to measure something. But you bring up a great point, is when there are questions, can you validate, or has the algorithm that you're using been validated so that at least you know how sensitive or reliable the thing is. One question did come up from the webcast around, and this is getting into methods, but it's methods about doing data. So I think it's maybe getting close to the line, but still good enough to talk about here. Is sort of this question around, it seems to be some inconsistency in the way researchers might go about validating something. And are we concerned about that, or how does that factor into this discussion?
When we're thinking about the sort of, what we're talking about today is sort of different sources of error and where they come from, sort of errors in clinicians' ability, basically clinical judgment, errors created by sort of recording incentives, errors created by broken data streams and, sort of technical problems. I hadn't thought about that, but when you talk about adjudication, I think we really want to think about, well, what kind of mistakes is adjudication or post-processing or some kind of expert reassessment, what's it for? I don't think it's for, problems in, sort of the technical problems. I think it really is it's for going back to that source clinician, I guess, and saying, do I agree or not agree with what that source clinician said? And this gets back to, what, Jesse was saying about, usually it's a gray area. We say it has to be a 0 or 1 when the answer maybe it's 0.8 or 0.3. Maybe we'd be better off actually telling the truth and saying this is about a 0.8 myocardial infarction and this is about a 0.2 myocardial infarction. I think it's also different when you have the full data that clinician was responding to. So, two very different scenarios. One would be, we've got the imaging. We've got the imaging file that some provider looked at, so we have perfect ability to go back after the fact and say, I agree or disagree with that judgment. If we're doing the other extreme, is an area I work in, where we're looking at the notes of an emergency department encounter and trying to say, was this really a self-inflicted injury or was this an accident? And we can't put ourselves in a time machine and go back into that emergency department visit and interview that patient ourselves. All we've got are some often really low quality text notes. So we could do expert adjudication and say whether it agrees, but I suspect we'd be comparing random error with random error.
And to further highlight, the way I would think about this question is actually, incorporating, just like we do in clinical trials, having some, what's the approach of quality by design. So it depends on the context for which you need to consider, where are you going to go forward in terms of validation. So in our use case, bleeding is an important aspect. If the only focus is on major bleeding, which is required blood transfusions, that is something that's routinely captured because it's a product that's really followed and also as reimbursed in terms of actually dispensing blood. If the issue is really actually discerning minor bleeding, such as nosebleeds or bruising, that's a very different thing. And so there, like, you may have some ability for capturing that, say, an electronic health record system, but there may be a lot more uncertainty about it. But then it gets to the point as, will it matter? Because it somehow have a systematic bias in terms of how it's being collected or reported. So is Duke collecting it in a different fashion versus UNC, for example, because of a different incentive structure?
Okay, great. So I am going to open it up to the audience. I think we've this has been a really good discussion. We've gone through the questions, and you've actually helped also indicate sort of how to answer these questions along the way. And so far, I didn't hear any additional questions except for one about thinking about the real-world providers, whether or not they're able to accurately identify what's of interest. But that said, it seems like this initial list of questions are in fact the right ones, and so I'd like to open it up to the audience to sort of help test that and see if there are other things that we should be.
Actually, I want to channel Andy one more time because I'm looking down at the list of things he thought were important to say, and there was one that we didn't talk about yet. And it's this we didn't talk about it directly. It's this question about sort of incomplete ascertainment due to health system issues. The idea that, even if an event of interest occurs, and even if someone sought health care for that event and a provider recognized it and recorded it appropriately, but it's not in the data stream that I'm using for this, for this, meaning I'm using claims data from a particular insurance system and this claim was never submitted, or I'm using electronic health records from a group practice and this person sought care outside the group practice even though they usually seek care inside the group practice. So that issue of, can you define a denominator population and have relatively good confidence? And I think as what Andy said is, it's complicated because it's not random. There certainly are some events that might be more or less likely to sort of stay, I don't know whether you want to call it sort of in-network, in-group, in-house, and there's some events that might be more likely to leak.
Yeah.
And that might depend on the nature of the event, even interestingly, sometimes how stigmatized an event is. An event that's more stigmatized might be more likely to leak and appear elsewhere.
Okay, we'll go to the audience. Rob, we've got floating mics, and we also have a mic in the aisle.
And Rob, Greg has a bell.
I'm not afraid of Greg's bell. My bell's bigger than his. But let's talk about the emperor for a minute here, because what really happened in the cures legislation is when they locked the doors and blocked the FDA from coming in, they made an error in the cures legislation and defined real-world data as real-world evidence as everything except for clinical trials. And we got it fixed thanks to the current FDA leadership in the reauthorization bill to data that comes from sources other than traditional clinical trials. So the emperor here is traditional clinical trials, and there seems to be this persistent assumption that because you have someone who had a plan and had one sheet of paper that matched another sheet of paper, it means that data actually is an accurate representation of the experience of a participant in a research study. And I think when we talk about validation and looking at the quality of the data, now that we have much better sources from multiple looks at a person, we're going to find that a lot of what seemed to be right in that relatively closed system looked good because everything matched up that was looked at, but didn't include a lot of things that could have been looked at. I mean, the old examples in cardiology used to be the people that had cardiac events at other hospitals, and you have to, somehow have the person remember to ask to get the medical records in a traditional clinical trial to get that information, and we already knew that was spotty. But, a great example that's going to emerge in Greg's field is you ask people, are you depressed? They give you one answer. If you go to Google search, you'll find there are a lot of depressed people who are talking to a computer and not to a study coordinator. And so I think we've got to attack the emperor, because there are a lot of problems that have occurred with regulated medical products because of the emperor. And I'll just pick on opioids and depression as two good examples. We did a great job of proving that we could measure pain and tooth extraction when opioids were developed, but enormous amounts of data that are hard to get through traditional methods and were never asked have led to one of the biggest national problems in our history. And, there are many other reasons for it, but one of the core issues is we never looked at the consequences over a longer period of time in people living in the real world of what would happen with this. And in depression, the story of the short-term, non-representative studies, often involving people who are chauffeured in a limousine to a study site that had nothing to do with real depression. It's just not a good, valid source of data for the intended purpose, which is to write a label so that people can actually use the therapy in the context of the world they're operating in. So my main takeaway from this is I heard a sound vote for validation, but I think we need to validate on both sides, and we need to understand when not using real-world evidence might actually be dangerous to the intended population. And that's going to take courage, because companies don't like to expose the fact that they may not have ground truth. And, so the last thing I'll say is, I'm living in the machine learning world now on the West Coast, and I'll just tell you, in health data, far and away the hardest thing to get is actual ground truth, because you can't develop a machine learning model unless you know what the ultimate answer is. And, for a lot of simple things, you get two clinicians to look at it or two experts, you get two different answers. And I like Greg's idea of the 0.8 or the 0.7, because that's actually really what we're dealing with.
One thing, Rob, to highlight about ascertaining of events in a clinical trial versus the real world. So not just patient recall, but having a study coordinator. If you ever watch a study coordinator try to go through electronic health record and all the things that are in there to find out whether someone had an event or not within a 15-minute time span, it's simply not really possible to have that complete evaluation compared to having something that can be electronically triggered or electronically reported.
Someone who cares about data is actually nauseated.
I think, just to follow what, Papa and Rob said, one thing is I think sometimes there is a confusion between the measurement and the measuring instrument and the thing being measured. And we have sometimes, taken the traditional measuring instrument or tool and thought that is the thing. That is not the thing. The thing is a health state. And so when we compare, as you're saying, we need to validate on both sides. What we don't want to do is say, let's develop a new measurement tool and validate that against the old measurement tool. We want to validate it against the actual thing being measured. It's not tool versus tool. It's new tool against the real thing.
I would just argue, being deeply immersed in this right now, that we have to do both, because, and actually the reason to do both is if we don't ground it to the old tool, you can't win the argument in the regulatory space or in the clinical review space at the NIH, for example.
That stone-faced guy in dark glasses will ask you why you didn't use the old tool.
Absolutely. And because you mentioned, I want to just give a shout out again. I think your list, there are these things like inception time, latency of data, and when you really need a particular measure at a particular time, that can't be surmounted in some cases by, and I think making sure in the report that that's really, really clear to people, the difference between when you need something at a particular time and it's not going to be measured.
Yeah, question?
Hi, Mark Wine. In an era when about 30,000 veterans are dying per year from suicide with multiple conditions that contribute to suicidality, just one point you made, Andrew, in general. 2 years ago, when President Obama held his second annual Precision Medicine Initiative, there were about 300 or so people from government and industry in the room with him. And he made a salient point. Many of you are in industry, in healthcare. Many of you are generating results, solutions that are revenue-driven and don't take the patient outcomes, quality, and prevention of disease into consideration first. And we've got to do things differently, the president said. So I will say that to whatever pharmaceutical corporation there is, using big data, moving to machine learning, and artificial intelligence, which is one reason why I called for enhancing healthcare through big data, not just big data and the algorithms, which you've spoken about eloquently, in clinical biomedical research, but open big data so that we can have trust in safety in the development of products that are designed like an infusion pumps to inject medications on internets of things and webs, that it's accurate and is going to contribute to the outcome of the patient. Plus, I'll bet my house that there aren't 5% of primary care physicians in this greater metropolitan area who can discuss anything about those war orphan studies knowledgeably and culturally in terms, semantic, interoperably, that the patient can understand. Nor do they have a consistent, interoperable, electronic longitudinal health record that's meaningful use. So I look to a list of factors that you can address. Karen DeSalvo's data blocking report to Congress of 3 years ago. The patient-physician engagement of ONC as a leadership point to achieve. The medical device trust in safety for vulnerabilities and threats in the Internet of Things, where wearables, wireless, implantables are becoming the way we capture evidence-based patient data of average daily behavior to help determine and deliver in semantically, culturally flat terms the co-occurrences of illness. Is it MI? Is it polycystic ovary syndrome that's in the vernacular infertility genetically caused supposedly in women, 37 million in the United States? Or is it a multitude of other co-occurrences that's changing the DNA?
Okay.
That's being discovered. So lots of factors to address.
Okay, appreciate those comments. Next question.
Can you address those?
No.
How about the medical device product? Please.
I don't think I have an answer. So. Okay.
The answer is, how can we follow, as medical device manufacturers, better the FDA guidelines for pre- and post-market manufacturing for cybersecurity?
Thanks. Next question.
I'm going to go for a different direction. The question I have relates to the validity of the information that you achieve when what you want is something that's a final diagnosis. So, for example, on the question of MIs, how accurate is that? If this typical sequence now with the way we're required to code things is to say chest pain, and you may or may not get a change in the diagnostic code from chest pain to MI or to pulmonary embolus until quite a bit more data comes in. And how good are we at following through? When you take these large studies with 20,000 people, how good are we at following through those relatively vague diagnoses to something that is substantiated by some means as a final meaningful endpoint?
So, so two things. One, just in a traditional trial, when we adjudicate events, two reviewers don't agree all the time. So that's a known thing. And the question is there a systematic bias for getting to that answer? So if a definition or either how it's being used has a systematic bias in terms of treatment assignments, then that would be an issue. But if having the same definition that has, in terms of either specificity or sensitivity, is not different based on treatment assignment, then that's not an issue. So just point out that, like, the issues in terms of how something's defined or recorded or clinically captured exists within a trial as well as within a data system.
Although what you'd have in both sides is a potential for an attenuation of the rate if, in fact, you never get the label. And this is, I would think it's a worse problem in real-world evidence studies where you aren't necessarily prospectively setting up to capture each event. The more real-world evidence is
we tend to actually see higher event rates because of the broader population and higher risk population. So,
but I think the point you're making is, I think, worth sort of, underlining and recalling that there's a difference between two observers looking at the same observed facts and attaching a different label to them versus, in this case, the facts were observed and in this case they were not. Because, in a traditional trial context, we make sure things are observed. We measure them at specific intervals, and those intervals are defined, and the measures to be collected are defined. So you try. But I think that idea of, we have the same raw data and we came to different conclusions, that probably is a solution for the answer is somewhere in between. It's more like 0.7 or 0.6 than it is like 1.0. But this problem that we've talked about of, if there is something that would go unobserved in a more naturalistic context, we can't fill that in later.
There's a counter pressure, though, getting back to the reimbursement discussion. We've seen for some events we see higher event rates in the broader population because it generates a bill.
Second slide.
Right.
With the question. I'm going to talk to the second slide.
But the delayed diagnosis was one that struck me because I've watched the shift from, we used to just rule out MI, and you can't do that anymore. You've got to put chest pain as your diagnosis.
Okay.
So I did get a couple questions on the, let's go to you first, and then I'll have two from the web to go to.
Oh, okay, thank you. Hi, Sheila Weiss from Evadera. And I asked them to freeze a slide, this one, because I'm a card-carrying epidemiologist, and I think there's a few of us in the room. And if you look at these questions, obviously, and you spoke to an epidemiologist on your team, the first thing they're going to say, well, it depends, right? We drive people crazy because we could never give you a yes or no answer. And so if you look at this and you take reasonably and consistently and you change it to reliably and valid, these are the same questions we ask every study for every question. And I would argue it depends is depending on your question, depending on your data, depending on your outcome, depending on your exposure, depending on the practice of medicine in the system, all these, and then again, depending on why you're doing this study, the reason, these answers are going to change. So it's really hard to answer this yes or no because it's always going to be case specific. And I would even argue if I'm asking, even within development, if I'm asking a question that has to do with money or formularies or valuing two drugs that are on the market, I might have a different, we always use a clinical p-value. My p-value might be wider. I might have a lot more wiggle room and feel much more comfortable with that than if it was a question of whether or not a drug would be on the market or someone would be harmed. So again, the confidence and the reliability and validity, how good that has to be, even depends on the context. So these are the kind of things I think we need to kind of get away from this yes, no, and into the bigger picture. And I'm laughing again, you mentioned safety, big safety. One of the issues we have, and you brought it up, I think, Andrew, between these kind of rare events, what's a big safety issue? And when you're doing an epidemiologic study and data, you're defining everything ahead of time. So, of course, if you haven't defined it, you're not looking at it, you're not going to see it, versus where you were saying about machine learning and different tools where you're actually looking for signals. So, again, what you're going to do and why you're doing it is going to change the answer to the question.
Great.
I just want to add, because I'm thinking about the same thing, but I actually don't agree with, it's always case by case. I mean, those are the questions that I use to ask myself whenever I want to design a study. But I do think there are some common rules you can use. In terms of population, there are many algorithms developed for certain diseases. You actually know the accuracies. There are certain algorithms being validated before. There are many academic groups looking into particular ways to identify diabetes and all sorts of things. There's many. They are validated. When you do a study, you can actually do your own validation first and trying to understand how accurately the algorithm you're going to use to identify population, you have certain confidence about it. So that's something you can do. Second, about exposure, and that's a harder one. But if you're in the biological world, and if your exposure is actually injection or IV, and it's usually done in a clinical setting, actually with high confidence it's usually done, you're sure about exposure. But when it comes to drug or inhaled products, then that's a tricky question. Then you just have to put some faith in the data and come up with some way to look at exposure. It's not going to be perfect, but hopefully the data volume or the larger sample can overcome that particular concern. In terms of the right outcome, and it's also breaking into different categories. If a certain events or number of events like hospitalization, MI, we know the data is actually pretty accurate to give you the right outcome. But if it comes to a particular lab measure or continuous variable about lung function, FEV1, and we know that might not be reliable. So I think for many questions, there are common rules you can use because we talk about the practical approaches. There are practical approaches will help us address those questions. There will be always maybe answer in certain cases, but I do feel I like those questions, and I do think there are some practical approaches can be used to address those questions.
I think what we're saying was, trust what's been described before, but verify. So
yeah, and I
theme.
guess getting on that and bringing up there was a question from the web around this on when you say accuracy is good enough, what is good enough? And, are there reasonable thresholds that we could put up in terms of the specificity, or when we do a validation study, what is good enough? What should we expect? And does it really depend, or could we put some guardrails up?
So I think it has to depend on the context. I hate to say that. So in the context, is giving as a use case. So a very large population is going to have a very broad exposure for a treatment to reduce the risk of stroke. If it had a higher risk of MI, for instance, I think that's something you'd want to really know about. There are other cases where there are questions that come out, say, from a basic lab that say, there's a question of a rare, uncommon cancer that can occur with, say, a diabetic therapeutic. Well, relative to the other benefits, that may not be as important. So it's context.
And I think when we talk about it's. But I appreciate, that last point, that this issue of validation is complicated, and it does depend, but you can't stop there. You can't let it go at that, or we'll never get anywhere. So, as Adrian just said, if we have, reasonably well-vetted algorithms for identifying certain clinical phenomena using the data exhaustive healthcare, what we would want to say is, first of all, that the process of developing and validating those algorithms should be completely transparent. And by transparent, I mean not just, if our algorithm is there need to be 2 of these within 30 days and then 1 of these and then not 1 of these within 90 days of that. we'd want to know the prevalence of every one of those components that contributes to that and the cross-classification of all of those. And that's really critical, because then if we're attempting to use that moving forward, we need to know that all the building blocks looked the same, not just that the final delivered result looked the same. Because if the building blocks don't look the same, we can't trust the final result. Now that gets pretty nerdy, and I think it requires a higher level of transparency than we are accustomed to. But my experience is it's absolutely critical. Because when one of those well-validated algorithms doesn't work, it's often because one of the pieces looks wrong. And unless you're able to look at the individual pieces and find out that's what looks wrong, you would be fooled.
I'm just going to add a little nerd color to that. So the question of what's good enough is actually a quantifiable one, because there are correction factors that you can calculate. There are sensitivity analyses that you can do that get to the question of, given this result, how big an effect could there really be?
Tipping point.
Tipping points. There's we've done some work on kind of causal inference instrumental variables, where you can actually show, we observe a 1.3, it could actually be a 1.8. So there are those kinds of calculations that you can do, and at least get some reassurance that you're not going too badly wrong, or maybe you are.
So thank you. I sort of just want to follow up on Greg's comment. As I'm looking at this question, it almost comes to me like the thing that I would want to ask myself before I say when is accuracy good enough is like, what would I want to know of how the data is being extracted, ascertained from the electronic healthcare records or claims for me to be answered these questions? So exactly, what is the algorithm created consistently to come up with these endpoints? Or what is the algorithm to come up with the sort of the disease or so that I can assess if this is the right populations or not?
It's also important to help reproduce it, say, in other systems, or if the question emerges in another area. So the case example we use were common questions that come up in different areas.
Question?
Yeah, my name is John Birch. I'm with the Mid-America Angels Investment Group in Kansas City. I've got a question or a point really that relates to your 1, 2, 3, number 5 question up there, concerns about data collection. You were talking about EHR data primarily and concerns about the accuracy and reliability and consistency of the data as entered in an EHR. It's worth keeping in mind that the EHRs are a moving target themselves. And if we're talking about something today that we might be using in 5 years from now, it's going to be very different. At least there's reason to think that it might be. In other words, that the very relevance, the importance, the value of EHR data, as it is known that it is becoming used for regulatory purposes or for drug development purposes, will start, I think, is likely to change. Might become more reliable, might become less reliable. But I think that that's worth keeping in mind. Specifically, ICD-10 is soon going to be giving way to ICD-11, and I've been informed that ICD-11 will be the end of the line. From then on, it's going to be the facts will speak for themselves, the biological, physiological facts. We won't put labels on them. We will just let physiology speak for itself. And that's a very interesting challenge. I guess I just throw those out as you ask what information is needed to answer those questions. I think some sense of what the trends are in EHR data itself is worth considering.
Just kind of related to that is, some people have also talked about patient-reported data, so like in how that's going to be integrated or potentially integrated. So obviously that's an area that has to be considered that is really just starting in terms of that integration.
Well, natural language also, that's major in the future.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think part of the challenge is that the clinical trial endpoints don't generally align with the real-world endpoints. And generally, the clinical trial endpoints, for example, are not even relevant to the real world. So what can be done to, on the one hand, we're able to measure the real-world endpoints, but also make the clinical trial endpoints more relevant, but whether it's from a patient perspective or more relevant to clinical practice, routine clinical practice, et cetera?
Well, I would say that people would probably have a different opinion in terms of clinical trial endpoints being relevant. So things like survival, staying out of the hospital, not having a stroke, that can be pretty relevant. I think what you may be also considering, are there patient preferences in terms of types of endpoints in the complete journey of a patient? And certainly that is an aim going forward of how that gets more incorporated.
I think it is a good point about the relevance of the endpoint to the ultimate decision maker who's, if you're developing a package for FDA versus for payer coverage and reimbursement or payment decisions, or even providers and health systems making decisions. It really highlights the importance of, and value of real-world evidence, where you do have the opportunity to bring in not just potentially a lower-cost way of developing evidence, but evidence that is reflective of the real world and increasingly able to incorporate outcomes that do matter to patients, to providers, to payers. And so the way I look at it is not necessarily going back and using that to change the endpoints in the trials, but rather developing an evidence package that includes trials and real-world evidence and other sources of information that really does get a more well-rounded picture of the impact of these products. But, yep.
That hit a hot button with me because you have to wonder if clinical trial endpoints aren't relevant to the real world. What can you learn from the clinical trial if the purpose is to inform safety and effectiveness, or whether a treatment should be used? There certainly are purposes other than that, understanding biology, et cetera, that might be important. But it seems like in this data validation part, one part of the validation ought to be that whatever's being measured actually is grounded in something that matters. And there's this enormous area now of accelerated approvals where by design you're not measuring something that necessarily matters in the real world. You're measuring a biomarker, and by law, not even a validated biomarker, but there's this other piece that's supposed to follow where you actually do measure something that matters in an appropriate context. But I think you hit up on something that ought to be in the chart of what you need to do to validate. We ought to be exposing areas where people are doing trials with irrelevant clinical endpoints. And I think, I used opioids as an example. I think in retrospect, it was a big one.
Just a quick response to that, Rob. Since we were talking about anticoagulants, oral anticoagulants, our first indication for rivaroxaban was in post-surgical prevention of thrombotic events. The clinical trial endpoint was all VTEs, including ones that were diagnosed on venography, which nobody actually does in the real world. But the secondary and more important endpoint was the clinical endpoint of symptomatic VTE or death. And so the program of trials was planned to get at the clinical endpoint that was of interest, even though it's a much less common endpoint. So you can plan ahead. I mean, often it's a question of efficiency and how quickly you can get the trials done, but pooled across data sources, you can get an answer sometimes.
Yeah, and I'll say, since I work in the mental health area, it's an area where all the outcome emperors have no clothes at all. And there, I think, people do care about myocardial infarction. I think people care about hemorrhagic stroke for sure. I don't think most people care about a Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score or a Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive score or a Young Mania Rating Scale score. I don't think those comport to people's experience or say what's happening in their lives. So that's an area I think where certainly what we don't want to do is to act like that's a gold standard, or to say that any new way of assessing the effectiveness of treatments for mental health conditions is measured against those things, because those things are downright silly, I think. And, I think what that moves us to, and, I know I'll be singing from Rob's hymn book here, what we want to know is how people are out functioning in the real world. And if you want to know that, you probably want to talk to their mobile devices, not to their psychiatrists, because their mobile devices know how they're functioning in the real world, and their psychiatrists, being one, often have no clue. It's still, in a time where, that we would call it an outcome, where we would ask someone, do you feel like you are thinking more slowly than usual? Well, ask your phone already. It knows. Are you less interested in things that you usually enjoy? Ask your phone already. It knows. So that's a case, I think, where we most definitely would not want to say, there is a clinical trial outcome that we must somehow make this new real world evidence conform to. I agree, maybe for political reasons or just to smooth the waters, we may need to do some of that stuff. But fundamentally, I think if we're saying we want to know whether treatments improve people's lives, we need to throw out a lot of that stuff.
So that's a good point, and a question maybe in the last, I guess we have 8 minutes or so left in this session, is with regard to mobile health data, wearables and apps and things like that. These questions were probably developed thinking about EHRs and claims, but as we think about new sources of data like the mobile apps, or even, presumably sources of data that we can't think of yet, that aren't around yet, but will be. Are these questions flexible enough, or I guess robust enough, to apply to real-world data sources like mobile apps and other mobile technology, or not? Perhaps many of them are, but perhaps not. So think about that if you have more questions, but I will take more comments.
I think
or
just,
points.
kind of an example of that is, people are really interested in, say, activity level. So wearing Fitbits, etc. And so two things come up is, what's clinically meaningful. So like you can have a lot of detail in terms of understanding to the minute someone's activity, and you can actually find potential small differences pretty easily in terms of that. But then what's clinically meaningful? And then the second thing gets to kind of the validity. Like, is it my kid or my dog, or am I showing my activity? And in my house, it's all the above. When the kids play with a Fitbit and then also want to put it on the dog. And so I can look very good.
But just to push back on well, both of those are entirely true. The question of clinically meaningfulness with this data gives rise to the potential for lots of not clinically meaningful differences, but that gets to sort of the effect size and maybe gets beyond the accuracy and validity of the data themselves, but more towards maybe some of the other sessions today. So, ding ding. But the other point on validity certainly applies, and I think that the questions that we're deriving here in terms of the accuracy of the outcomes, and also if we believe that the person is able to identify the right outcome, does get to, and the ability to record this does get to whether or not the dog is recording the data versus not. So these questions still apply in that case.
So I'm going to get away from the dog and just issue a challenge. And this is based on an N of one, not even an experiment, but on a hike one time. 3 or 4 people were wearing something on their wrist that supposedly was recording steps and how far they walked. And some of it was uphill and some of it was... So the challenge is, take 5 or 10 people, walk around the block, go up some stairs, and then compare your results across your wristwatch devices and see what you get.
That's a really important challenge. But let's look at the emperor. Some clinician, based on what a patient says, saying this is New York Heart Association class 2 or 3. I mean, So we need to, now that we have the ability to measure, we need to really do the work. But what we've come to rely on, I would say, has even more problems.
Yeah, one of the challenges, I think, is our acceptance of traditional measures because they are transparent, or especially in the case of measures that where in the old-fashioned way, people come to my place. They come to my building, they sit in my chairs, they're on my turf, I ask them questions, they obey my rules. I have now controlled this sort of encounter, and therefore the information that comes from it seems real and true to me. I say seems, and I want to underline the seems. If I want to know what this person's life is like, that may have had nothing to do with what their actual life is like. But we have a greater difficulty trusting information that was created out of our sight. The information that somehow was created out there in circumstances I can't control. I think it's related to data that comes from mobile devices, data that comes from the world out there. It also is related, as you say, to more complex algorithms. If we're saying, we've got a random forest-based classification that considers 100 things in deciding whether this is a myocardial infarction, and it's actually way better than any expert adjudication. But if you said, well, tell me why it's true or not true in that situation, the answer is, I'm sorry, I can't. You just have to trust. So there is going to be a challenge here when we consider sources of data that are likely actually more accurate, but a lot more difficult for our caveman brains to understand.
May I make a comment? I apologize for my late arrival, first of all. My name is Christina Steffen. I'm a physician informaticist. And Greg, to your point, your comments about clinical remarks and the narrative are very important, as is the patient perspective. But those algorithms can be boiled down to factors and their weights in a list, a checklist, just like many other tools that we use in medicine. The other thing, to Greg's point, maybe we ought to expand the notion of social determinants of health and include the dogs and the pets and the alligators that live with us. Just a thought.
Could I? Yeah, it's Bill Potter at the National Institute of Mental Health. So to follow up on this idea of validity, Dr. Caleb's point about ground truth and some of the comments Greg has been making, let me throw out this use case about driving a conclusion of what's of value from real world evidence. So I'll ask the panel. So the real world evidence would, and you can tell me if you believe it, might support that somehow lowering cholesterol or taking statins might be good for you in the long run. What would it take, or do we have any idea what the nature of real-world evidence would need to be to say that taking your SSRI is good for you in the long run? So depending on how you run the game, I might come up with a number needed to treat, using that approach, 10 people for anybody, the likelihood that anybody taking their SSRI is doing a particle of good. But I would assume, and maybe Dr. Caleb could answer, I'm assuming that people would say the number needed to treat to convince yourself that a statin is doing you any good in the long run might be a little different. So is there some way, I may be wrong, maybe it's 10, maybe 9 out of 10 people don't even, statins aren't doing anything. I don't even know I don't know the answer to that. But the question is can the field, is there a path to estimating, like the 0.8 certainty of a diagnosis, estimating the extent to which our evidence chain for validity is close enough to the ground truth to which Dr. Caleb was referring earlier on? And what do we need to do as a research community as an intermediate step to be more or less confident in certain classes of real-world evidence? So any advice in that area would be most appreciated.
It depends. Any other?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it likely is relevant in terms of, in terms of kind of the public perspective. So like of, say, the top 10 public health problems, is it on that list, for instance? And that would be a way to say, okay, this is of great public importance that, say, we want to understand the risk of cardiovascular death, for instance, or MI. But then also within patients, preferences may vary. So that would, someone who has, really disabling pain may have a very different perspective than, say, similar injury, but a different assessment of their pain.
Yeah. Kathy, did you have a question?
Very quickly, I was going to. Can people hear me? So I think these are great questions, and as I look at them, I'm trying to figure out, well, what is the role of pre-specifying when is this good enough versus after the fact? I mean, after the fact, we can characterize how good things were. And so and particularly as we think about this from a regulatory context or, when we're looking at these data, what are your thoughts in terms of, when do you need to specify things ahead of time and what in that condition or what that state is good enough versus after the study when we're able to convince people that it was good enough?
It's a great question.
I'll say as much as possible, and I'll just say that from some experience where we'll see some studies where they've gotten unbelievable results, and actually so unbelievable they're probably not true. And so they were able to, as they were looking at, say, a question, they discovered another answer. And so then they work backwards. And so I think that's always a challenge. And I think one key thing around this that we're talking about in terms of real data is around trustworthiness. And so the more that's transparent, the greater the trust people will have in terms of using that evidence.
Just, as an example, for instance, a trial we're doing now on suicide attempt prevention, a large trial where our outcome definitions were specified and actually, I'd say, validated in the ICD-9 era, and then we switched to ICD-10 in the middle of the trial. And as you may or may not know, the coding of self-harm in ICD-10 is dramatically different from ICD-9. And we knew that it was going to be, from looking at the taxonomy, dramatically different, but it certainly wasn't possible to say how will this be implemented in EHRs and how will providers actually use it. So we will be called upon while the trial is ongoing in some ways to look at that outcome specification. And in some ways, I have some discomfort with tinkering with the outcome specification while the trial is ongoing, but we don't have any alternative. So, but if I say, well, what principles should one follow there? Well, certainly it must be blinded, meaning we should not look at the results of the trial and then decide which outcome specification produces the desired result. It has to be done before we break the blind. That's foundational. But also it has to be completely transparent. I mean, every step in that process that we use to validate, specify, or adjust, that outcome definition needs to be completely public so that everyone can look at it. And we probably will need to, if they're viable alternatives, to report results under those alternative scenarios. So people will be able to say how sensitive were our results to that. But I think that's a sort of special case of the taxonomy transition. But I think, as we talked about, there are these transitions happening all the time. I mean, those who work in this area know, you're in the middle of a trial and something change. They adopt a new EHR, or even there's some change in the plumbing of the EHR which changes the data streams. And you have to both hold yourself accountable for not finagling things, to get the result you want, but being, open to the fact that you're going to have to adjust.
But the transparent around that, so it's acknowledged.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. Thanks to the panelists. It was a wonderful discussion, and to all of you for your comments, and to the folks from the web for sending in your questions as well. We're going to go ahead and take a break until about 11 o'clock. Thank you.